Hey everyone, so welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar organized by the Movement for Liberation from Nakba. My name is Hassanal. I am the one of the representative members of the Movement for Liberation from Nakba itself. Now, just a few housekeeping things that I wanted to go through with everyone. For everyone's information, this webinar was supposed to be live streamed, but right now we're having some technical difficulties with the live streaming setup itself. So once it is able to live stream, we will notify everyone of the live streaming webpage in the chat below. But the meeting will be recorded, so it will also be posted up at a later time as well. And then also, for the webinar itself, there will be a Q&A session based on the timetable here. And during the Q&A session, this will provide everyone an opportunity for attendees to enter their questions for our respective presenters to respond during the allocated Q&A session. I will like to ask for every attendee, should they have any questions, to share it in the Q&A bar under your control panel, and to also keep your questions courteous and succinct as well, succinct. So with that, I believe we can get the webinar started, and I would like to pass the floor to the moderator, Steve Little, who is an independent researcher from New Zealand and also a member of the MLN. Steve, I think the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hassanal. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. We cover all time spans, all time zones for this meeting. But welcome to MLN, Movement for the Liberation from the Nakba, Weaponizing Islamophobia against Palestine. I'm going to cut short my remarks so that we can be closer to time, but I'll just first of all go through what we are going to do in order. After my introduction, the first speaker will be Professor Ilan Pape on the role of Islamophobia in the making of Israel. The second speaker from London, Ahmed Hussein, Islamophobia and Zionism in Britain Today. And the third speaker, Dr. Junaid Ahmad, Islamophobia, Coloniality and the Politics of Resistance. At 5:30 Q&A, so 10:30 this time, and then closing remarks by Nida Arif, and she is in India, on Islamophobia, the way forward. I've been asked to give a small introduction for those of you who aren't aware of the advocacy group, MLN. The Movement for Liberation from the Nakba is a coalition of organizations and individuals from Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, or West Asia, if you don't like Middle East, Palestine, South Africa, UK, that aims to spread knowledge about Palestine, particularly in Asia. And yes, now also the Indo-Pacific, Australia and New Zealand. Thank you, Boris Johnson. The purpose of MLN is to raise critical awareness of the history of Palestine, of the 1948 Nakba catastrophe, and the plight of the Palestinian minority inside Israel, the occupied West Bank and the besieged Gaza Strip, and of course, the plight of millions of Palestinian refugees. The MLN project wishes to provide information about the history of the Palestinian struggle for liberation and is therefore very much in solidarity with it. As an introduction to tonight's topic, weaponizing Islamophobia against Palestine, I'll leave most of the introduction to Ilan Pape, but a couple of remarks about advocacy groups so far focusing on the way Israel has weaponized anti-Semitism. And it's done this in order to stifle debate. And that, of course, is paid little attention to the fact that it also involves Islamophobia for the same purpose. Israel's main method is to associate terror with Islam in general and the Palestinian political Islamic groups in particular. Hence, Hamas is part of world Islamic terrorism with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, a terrorism determined to destroy the Western civilization that Israel represents in the Middle East. The fact that Muslim communities identify with the Palestinian struggle in the West is not only because the majority of Palestinians are Muslims, but mainly because Palestine is the last place where Western colonialism still reigns in the midst of Arab and Muslim worlds. Support of Muslim communities for Palestine's struggle, smeared or branded by Israel as Islamic terror, is not only Muslim, but one part of a global network of support. This is the common thread of previous webinars and tonight's. The global struggle for human and civil rights for all in historical Palestine. I'd now like to briefly bio or introduce the speakers on the topic, beginning with Professor Pape. Professor Pape is an expatriate Israeli historian and socialist activist. He is now a professor with the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter in the UK, director of that university's European Centre for Palestine Studies, and co-director of the Exeter Centre for Ethno-Political Studies. He's born and educated in Israel. Prior to coming to the UK around 12 years ago, he was a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Haifa from 1984 to 2007, and chair of the Emil Tuma Institute for Palestinian and Israeli Studies in Haifa for 2008. He's the author of 20 books. He's on his 21st at the moment. And these include The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine in 2006, The Modern Middle East in 2005, A History of Modern Palestine, One Land, Two Peoples in 2003, and Britain and the Arab-Israeli Conflict in 1988. I'm going to cut short my introduction now. It's just so that we can keep to time, and ask Ilan Pape if he would like to begin speaking now. Prof. Ilan.
Here we are. Sorry. Steve, thank you so much for introducing me. Thank you, everyone, for attending this important and crucial webinar. I want to thank everyone who was involved in the MLN, in the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, who was involved in preparing this, and especially the guests that were willing to be part of our distinguished panel. So without any further introduction, I will delve into the topic that I was asked to speak for, and I will do it hopefully within 15 minutes. Islamophobia, of course, when you translate it to English, is the fear of Islam. But it's much more than fear. It is a mixture of attitudes that are born out of racism, ignorance, and denial. And in fact, when you unpack attitudes to Muslims or to Islam, even outside the context of Palestine, you can see this mixture of all these elements that I have mentioned as forming a racist attitude that, of course, has real implications for people's well-being and sometimes lives. It is more than just fear itself or racism itself. It is also sometimes a cynical way to manipulate public opinion in various historical junctures in various societies to distract societies or people when governments or political leaderships are unable to deal with political, economic, or social problems. In this respect, it's not that different from anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in Europe was manipulated by corrupt European regime or unsuccessful European regimes, whether they were republics or monarchies, who were unable to satisfy their people's economic, social, or cultural demands. And there was a way of distracting the attention by focusing on the Jews as the main cause of the problem. In a similar way, Islamophobia sometimes is used in such a way in the recent centuries, but also in our time. As we should see, the importance of including ignorance within the unpacking of the phenomenon of Islamophobia helps us to understand what might seem to be a conundrum. Because on the one hand, Islamophobia leads to the oppression of Islam, of Muslims, on assault on individual Muslims or on collective Muslim communities. But on the other hand, the very same powers that use oppression can use manipulation to try and recruit what they understand to be Islam or what they think are the nature of Muslim communities to serve their imperial interest. We've seen it, and I will come back to it in a minute. Britain was trying to use what it believed was the Islamic way of life in Palestine in order to challenge what it saw as an anti-colonialist movement within the Palestinian society. Israel did the same in Gaza when it thought that supporting the Muslim Brotherhood in the early 1970s would create a counterbalance to the anti-occupation forces of the Fatah and the left groups. And we are familiar with the Western thinking about it when it came to Afghanistan, and even before that, during the Cold War, in certain support to the Muslim Brotherhood movements. Why is it important to revisit these moments? Because at the heart of these false assumptions that you can create or push a wedge between what looks like a pious religious community that is only interested in religion, and on the one hand, and an activist group of people in the people you have colonized, occupied, or oppressed. And again, it turns out that anti-colonialism is a powerful human urge to liberate yourself from human oppression, whether you are very religious or whether you are only lightly religious or whether you are secular. What matters is that you are oppressed. And this is something that is the best challenge, of course, to the divide and rule policies that colonial powers and Israel as well is using every now and then by thinking out of ignorance and misunderstanding what Islam means to people who are either Muslims or non-Muslim within communities such as the Palestinian communities. So it's two sides of the same coin. The brutal attack on Islam and Muslims on the one hand, and the assumption that Islam can be, or Muslim communities can easily be manipulated because of the racist attitude and misunderstanding and total ignorance what Islam means to people in places such as West Asia or the Middle East. So in many ways, this was something that was very important in the whole history that led to the colonization of Palestine by the Zionist movement in 1882. All these elements played a very important role. Palestine encountered Islamophobia first during the time of the Crusaders, long before Zionism appeared, but it left a residue which is important to revisit every now and then. Christian European powers could not tolerate the idea that Palestine would be part of the Muslim world, but also used the Crusaders in order to distract their own failures in Europe or because of their infighting. And this kind of created the deeper historical layer of hate, racism, and ignorance. And it reappears again in the 19th century, both within the settler colonial movement of Zionism in the late 19th century and within the policymaker institutions of the most important power that supported the Zionist settler colonial movement, Britain. In fact, even before the Jews in Europe, which were a minority, by the way, of the Jewish community, developed the idea that Judaism is nationalism, and therefore Jews are entitled to have a homeland, and that Palestine is that lost homeland, and they also saw it as the best solution for the rising of anti-Semitism in Europe. Even before that happened, British policymakers, by their own accord, developed the idea that Palestine should be extracted from what they saw Muslim control, namely at the time, the Ottoman Empire. And these ideas developed, and not surprisingly, when it seemed that the Ottoman Empire is in total decline and on the eve of collapse and disintegration. According to these important British policymakers in the second half of the 19th century, Palestine had to be, first of all, Christian, and many of these policymakers were evangelical Christians, and therefore they believed actually that the way of making Palestine Christians went through of making Palestine Jewish. That has to do with a certain religious dogma they believed in, that the return of the Jews of Palestine was part of a divine scheme that would lead to the resurrection of the dead, the second coming of the Messiah, and to their rightful place in the end of time. So it could be Jewish for a while before it becomes Christian. So that was from a religious point of view. But most importantly, not just it had to be Christian or Jewish, it also had to be British. What comes very clearly from the evidence we have from that period is that one thing is common to all the policymakers in London who begin to plan and eventually become a proper strategic plan of tearing Palestine out of the Ottoman world and therefore out of the Muslim and Arab world and making it part of the British Empire, that Islamophobia plays a very important role in justifying to themselves and to their colleagues and public the need to make Palestine first Jewish, or should we say later on Zionist, and because from a religious point of view, it could also become later on, the end of time, also Christian. The most important thing, it should not be Muslim, or as they used to, the language they used in the late 19th century is Muhammadin. Yeah, that's the way you find it. If you go to the Public Record Office in London, now it's called the National Archives, and you look for documents from that period, you can see that this is the terminology used. So we encounter Islamophobia in the very formative period in which a very powerful coalition decided to turn Palestine from being an Arab country, a Muslim country, a Middle Eastern country, into a Jewish colony and later a Jewish homeland. And Islamophobia plays not an exclusive part, but a very important part in convincing policymakers and those who supported them that this is a justified historical act of transforming. I would call it even an act of reframing, or rather misframing, framing an Arab country as a Jewish country, framing a country that belongs to Islamic civilization as part of Western civilization. And all this, of course, collapses into the Balfour Declaration in 1917, where all these ideas are translated into a pledge by the British government to make Palestine both British and Jewish. We are interested in this framing, and we are interested in the role of Islamophobia in it because of the human cost that such a reframing and redefining of Palestine resulted in. It eventually led to the Nakba of 48, to the destruction of Palestine, to the dispossession of the Palestinians. Islamophobia played a very important role in justifying and sustaining not just the Zionist policies themselves on the ground, but the Western support for these policies from 1882 up to the catastrophe itself in 1948. Also among the settler colonialists themselves, if you read the diaries and memoirs of the early Zionists who come to Palestine and begin the colonization of Palestine, and they were very verbose. They wrote everything. Every mosquito bite did not escape them when they were writing. By the way, ironically, the early Zionists found the first places where they could live in were when they exploited the generosity of the Muslims who lived in places like Jaffa, who offered them an abode on their arrival to Palestine. And at night, under the gas lamp, they would write racist and abusive words about the Muslims and actually hosted them in their early steps of colonization, thinking that these are poor Europeans who deserve their compassion. And of course, they looked at the Muslims in Jaffa and the Palestinians in general, Christians and Muslims, as aliens who usurped their ancient homeland. But it's important to stress that within the racist, typical, by the way, to settler colonial movements such as Zionism, within the racist perceptions of the native indigenous population of Palestine as aliens, as people who can easily be replaced and displaced, the knowledge and rather ignorance about what is Islam and Muslim played a very important role. Now, I talked about the two sides of the coin, that there is oppression and suppression, and then there is the attempt to manipulate what you think is an Orientalist, what Islam is, for your own benefit. And that's why the British mandatory authorities divided the Palestinians into religious communities. They never talked about them as Palestinians. They talked about them as Muslim and Christians and Druze and Circassians. And they at first put their confidence in religious hierarchies and religious institutions in Palestine, such as the Majlis al-Ulama, the Council of the Muslim Scholars, or the Mufti's institution. And then they learned that you don't separate in a colonialist reality between your faith, your civilization, your culture. By the way, whether you're Muslim or Christian, the Islamic civilization was civilization for everyone. By the way, also for the Jews who were not Zionists before the arrival of Zionism. And then the British were surprised that the anti-colonialist movement that burst out in the big revolt in 1936 was both led by religious and non-religious leaders. I will end by and
Yeah, I'm not sure.
okay, I'm finishing. Well, we need to work for Palestine under extreme circumstances. I'll come back. So the fact that churches were not touched in the Nakba by the Israeli forces, but almost every mosque was destroyed, not only destroyed, but was treated in a disgraceful way, turned into discotheques and restaurants, or buildings for husbandry and animals and so on. This is more than just taking over a village and destroying it. It shows certain attitude towards someone else's face, and at the heart of it is racism. I will end by saying the following. At the heart of the Palestinian resistance to the Zionist colonization and the support it gets for the West is anti-colonialism. The anti-colonialist movement sometimes is led by ideologies that are more secular. Sometimes it is led by the ideologies which are more religious. When it was led by secular movements in the 1970s, the way that people tried to demonize the Palestinians and delegitimize the justified anti-colonialist movement was by framing them as communists in the 1970s, so that in the Cold War, they would look to be on the side of the enemy of the West. Since the 1980s, it is led by many ways by religious, political Islamic groups. So now the demonization is of Islam in order to delegitimize the justified Palestinian struggle for liberation and freedom. Of delegitimation is done now against a very brutal oppression. Every resistance to it is justified. This is also done in order to suppress any support and any attempt to show solidarity with an oppressed people that have been suffering for more than a century from colonization. The same weaponizing of anti-Semitism, probably the pieces that were not recorded were not that important, I hope. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ilan, because that really did bring both the historical and connections between religions together. Before I introduce our next speaker, Ahmed Hussein, when I was in London in 2005, just before the bombing, I remember going down the Old Kent Road, speaking of secular and sacred, and seeing a mosque there that used to be an Irish pub. And I thought, these English Muslims, they know how to convert one thing to another. I'd like to introduce Ahmed Hussein as a member of the Muslim Public Affairs Committee, UK. He is a Muslim activist who has campaigned on a wide range of issues since the 2000s, from Palestine to English university tuition fees to London housing costs. He is currently the CEO of Muslim Public Affairs Committees UK and seeks to increase the UK Muslim community's awareness of the threat of Zionism and increase awareness of the need of tackling this threat through political engagement and counter-lobbying. Welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you, Steve. Let me just get my screen up. Is my screen visible, Steve? Excellent. I want to thank the organisers of this event, the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, for coordinating such an important discussion, and I am humbled for being invited to add my own thoughts on Islamophobia and Zionism in Britain today. So firstly, I need you to understand the seriousness of the situation. We aren't talking about an abstract theory, as Professor Ilan has outlined. This is a very real, tangible threat to the way of life of Palestine. What I'm going to try to bring home in my part of the conversation is how it's a threat to the way of life to the people and the citizens of Britain as well. We are talking about how Islamophobia is being weaponized to further Zionism in a calculated and deliberate way. And the simplest way to demonstrate this is obviously with examples. So we can start off with Tommy Robinson. Every UK Muslim in this audience has heard of this Islamophobe. He's been bankrolled by Robert Shulman, who has senior positions in the Friends of the Israel Defense Forces and the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I'll come back to the Horowitz Freedom Center, but back to Tommy first. He's been publicly defended by US Republican politician Samuel Brownback, who threatened to get Trump to criticize the UK when Tommy was in prison. Brownback is also an open supporter of the Israeli National Union and National Religious Party Alliance, which openly demands annexation and ethnic cleansing of all Arabs from the West Bank. And I'm sure they're lovely people otherwise. Another backer of Tommy is Middle East Forum, who said they were heavily involved with release from prison. I'll come back to the MEF shortly as well. The last supporter from me I want to mention is Rebel News, whose founder, Israel Van, has shown willing to put money into any story as long as they are willing to say something negative.
Let me continue.
Yeah, so we see another Islamophobe, Raheem Kassam. He was supported by Breitbart News, which was founded by Andrew Breitbart and Larry Solov, who visited Israel in 2007 and pledged to be unapologetically pro-Israel. Has been in society, who in turn has been financially supported by the likes of Harold Calms, a former treasurer of the UK Conservative Party, has attacked Tory MPs who criticised Israel. The point I want to demonstrate is that Islamophobes and Zionists are not just intrinsically linked. They are more often than not in both camps, the same individuals in both camps. And when you look at the widespread and international nature of this web of support, the question naturally arises, why is there no restriction or limits on Zionists and the support for destructive policies? And the unfortunate answer is that in this moment in time, the spread and the support of Zionism is not being restricted by those in power in Britain. In fact, it is very much the opposite. And the simplest way of demonstrating this would be by analyzing the aftermath of Al Jazeera's excellent 2017 documentary, The Lobby. So just in brief, the documentary itself exposed plotting between an Israeli embassy official and members of the British political class from both sides of the divide, and also the machinations with university student organizations. I highly recommend watching it. It outright exposes how far Zionists are willing to go to build up support for Israel whilst undermining support for Palestine, and how the Zionists' goals and means resonate and are supported by the British political establishment. But the key point I want to draw your attention to are the consequences, or the lack thereof, as a result of this expose. So the Israeli ambassador, he apologized for some of the comments made by that Israeli embassy official. The official was himself pulled back to Israel, but that was pretty much it. You know, one guy lost his job. Opposition members in the UK called for inquiries and investigations, but the foreign secretary at the time regarded the matter closed. And that foreign secretary was Boris Johnson, who is now the Prime Minister of the UK. But was the matter really closed? Because a couple of very interesting things happened around that time of the documentary in 2017. The president, for example, the president of the National Union of Students, who had been labeled an anti-Semite, was ousted. And from 2017 onwards, the opposition and its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, faced more and more accusations of anti-Semitism. And here is where we come to the most important point of all of this. Tackling Islamophobia and supporting Palestine are both inherently critical of the status quo in Britain. And consequently, no British elite or establishment will be comfortable with either perspective gaining traction in British society. On the other hand, Zionism vilifies Palestine, vilifies Muslims and their advocates. Therefore, the goals and the means of Zionists resonate almost perfectly with those who hold and want to retain power. So what are the repercussions? Again, I'll show you a single snapshot that helps illustrate the whole. So my specific example is, or person I'm going to be focusing on, is the UK Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson. He earlier in the year sent a letter to schools in May, and the wider context of what was going on, as I'm sure everyone here in the audience knows, was that Israel increased its provocations and aggressions against Palestine in the Islamic month of Ramadan. Palestine supporters around the world and in the UK reacted, and particularly noteworthy in this point was that school students also decided to show solidarity on a scale we haven't witnessed in Britain before. So now you have students up and down the country who are formulating and expressing and sharing a political and humanitarian opinion. This kind of behavior, if you look at it objectively, this kind of behavior is exactly what a democratic society needs. So how does the Minister of Education respond in the UK? He sends a letter to schools equating support for Palestine with anti-Semitism and tells schools to be politically impartial, whilst he, a minister, also tells schools whom they should and shouldn't work with. And, you know, the irony must clearly have been lost on him. But his hardline support and intervention for Israel is no surprise, because in January 2018, Gavin Williamson addressed the Conservative Friends of Israel and said, quote, "Britain will always be Israel's friend," end quote. And also, quote, "We would like to think that we were very much at the birth of the nation and very much helped it in terms of its delivery and coming into the world," end quote. So what are the wider repercussions? We have Zionist politicians like Gavin here who are willing to push their views down onto society despite the undemocratic consequences of such fascism. And we also have politicians like Jeremy Corbyn who are targeted and hounded out of power out of a fear that they will try to bring overdue justice for Palestine. If I have a few minutes to talk about solutions, if that's right, Steve. Yeah, so I understand that talking about the way things are at the moment, they are depressing. Obviously, it's negative. That's why we've come together as a coalition, because we want to work on the positives. So I wanted to introduce this slide just to talk a bit about a few of the positives. But the essential idea is that we have to abnormalize Zionist organizations. We have to make it not normal to work with organizations that support the occupation and oppression of Palestine. And each of us in our weekly normal lives come across plenty of opportunities to do so. So, you know, businesses and boycotting, starting with the most well-known method of abnormalizing Zionist organizations is boycotts. Which is basically about shaming businesses for enabling the Zionist agenda. So, you know, voting with your feet, voting with your wallet, and refusing to do business with such businesses. Schools and colleges, as I mentioned before, in the UK, there is a great energy amongst the student body, and we should nurture that and enable that. Universities, I'm putting that separately to schools and colleges because their fight to support Palestine and oppose Zionism has been going on for much longer and has its own distinct flavor in the UK, and which should involve Palestine and membership of organizations. So again, you know, joining an organization like the organizers here, the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, or MPAC UK on a national level, or wherever you are in the world, such organizations give you the support and opportunities to do all of the above and then some. And I just want to add in another point of optimism. When I was asked to talk about Islamophobia and Zionism in Britain, I found that very aptly named because geographically, Britain does not cover Northern Ireland, and the island of Ireland as a whole has a much more honest and realistic view of Israel, to the point where in June of this year, the Belfast City Council demanded that Israeli ambassadors should be expelled from the UK and the Republic of Ireland. And I just mentioned that again as a point of interest and also optimism. You know, there is value in the work that we do, whether it's in coalition or in our national level. And my final point, basically, we need to unite for this cause. We need to organize our resources behind it, and we need to create institutions in order to amplify and maintain the pressure we need to win for the sake of Palestine. They have not given up. We must not either. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ahmed. That really was a practical and very interesting, I think, connection with Zionism and Islam and the negative attitudes towards it. Because I've often wondered, the US, we know a lot of where the money goes, but I've often wondered exactly those things for the UK. And nice to end up with something practical as well. The next and last speaker is Junaid Ahmed, and he is a professor at director of the Center for the Study of Islam and Decoloniality in Islamabad in Pakistan, and he's been teaching religion, law, and world politics for over a decade there. He's also the founder and chair of the Palestinian Solidarity Committee, and over the years he has been associated with the International Movement for a Just World. the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, Al-Awda, the Palestinian Right to Return Coalition, along with various interfaith initiatives and groups working for peace and justice, including Peace for Life and the US-Pakistan Interreligious Coalition. Junaid, welcome.
Hello and assalamu alaikum, and thank you to this wonderful group, MLN, that I'm proud to be a part of, to the other speakers who gave brilliant presentations and have left me a bit speechless because I'm not sure what further I have to add to what they have said. So I will actually make my remarks, this is good for the audience, shorter than anticipated, although of course we often say that, but it often is not true. But I will try to at least keep within the time and perhaps leave more time for question and answer. So I think that one of the most helpful definitions, although again, I think we should be wary of the principal objective when dealing with this issue of Islamophobia being the issue of determining a definition. I think definitions when it comes to, and I'll explain this later, when it comes to issues of racism, it's not so much the definition, it's the struggle to create popular awareness and consciousness of what is and what is not racism. So we can actually see, 10-year-old children can see things and they can see that something is racist and something is not. That has come from struggle to change public consciousness on these issues. Definitions and the legal battles actually come afterwards. But I kind of like the definition that was given by the all-party parliamentary group in actually the UK of Islamophobia, which was, if I remember correctly, a form of racism which targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And that's a very interesting definition because it takes the emphasis away from either Islam or the Muslim. And in some ways, the idea of a racism that targets Muslimness transcends both of these categories. I mean, very, very simple examples can give you a sense of what this means. For example, after 9/11, on September 14th, the first person that was killed in the United States, that was attacked and killed, wore a turban and had a beard, but was not a Muslim. It was a Sikh. You can see this in so many other ways. You know, I think that if there are expressions and markers of Muslimness, there's in fact like a science that has now developed. And you know, if you're a Muslim or look like a Muslim, whatever that means, you will know this very easily when traveling through airports. Of course, when airport traveling was more frequent pre-COVID, but you'll know right away. So of course, often there's a response that, look, you know, but Muslims are not a race. You know, they're a religion or something else, but they're clearly not a race. They come in all sizes, packages, colors, and whatever. But I think that misses the point of what racism actually is. I mean, we have to understand it's not races which create racism. It's in fact racism which create races. And I think that when you understand Islamophobia as a form of racism, then you can actually link it up to the struggles, the anti-racist struggles that have existed in say, the United States, the UK, as well as, and I'll speak about this, the anti-colonial struggles. Because I think that in Islamophobia, you in fact have the fusion of both racism as well as colonialism. And so when I speak about coloniality, it is about the ongoing world system that was created as a racial colonial world system. And so I think that this is what structures the world order. And I think that this is in fact where there's a convergence between Islamophobia and what you can call anti-Palestinian racism and the ongoing settler colonial project against the Palestinians. And I think that in this sense, it's not so much a weaponization. I mean, of course, one can look at it from that angle as well. That's clearly the case, the weaponization of Islamophobia against Palestine. But in some ways, I think that the figure of the Muslim, which is different, again, from an actual Muslim you can speak to or touch, or, well, don't touch them, but you know what I mean. I mean, so it's different from an actual Muslim or so on, but the figure of the Muslim, the way the Muslim is represented, I think that in fact, that figure of the Muslim and the figure of the Palestinian is actually mutually constitutive. At this particular stage, you can see the parallels of how these two categories, in fact, interrupt what is, you can say, is a Eurocentric Western colonial narrative about what is quote unquote progress, what is quote unquote modern, what is quote unquote, which turns out to be a specific Western notion of all of these things. So I think that when we see all of these moral panics in these societies, and in fact, it's not limited. I mean, I think this is a key point, that Islamophobia is not limited to the Western plutocracies or democracies, whatever you want to call them. It's not limited there. Some of the most Islamophobic, you can add Zionists to it as well, societies, regimes, are within so-called the Muslim world itself. And because at the heart of it, it is in fact the fear of a political subjectivity, which is challenging a whole gamut of cruelties and injustices taking place in the world today. And you can see this, it's so, in fact, ironic, it's so bewildering, why so many societies are in fact redefining themselves on the figure of the Muslim. You go to the administrators of, say, genocide in Burma. You go to the kind of Jim Crow system that has now been instituted, sadly enough, within India. You go to obviously the Zionist structure within apartheid Palestine. You go to places, you listen to Macron in France, and you can write, it's the same vocabulary, it's the same playbook repeated again and again and again. You can almost write the communiques of all of these people. It's the radical Muslim, it's the extremist Muslim, it's the terrorist, it's the misogynist, sexist. And of course, the good thing about Muslims is that you can always say that, well, we may be patriarchal and whatever this time, but we're not as bad as those Muslims. And so they become very, and this is why in some ways we have to understand that from these ruling elites, just like Zionism and colonialism, Islamophobia is a very productive discourse, productive in the sense that it, as Professor Pape was speaking, it legitimizes and justifies all the particular practices that now in some ways we are expected to have gotten used to. And this is also key as well, that the war on terror, I mean, believe it or not, the war on terror has been nearly half as long. I mean, we don't think about this, nearly half as long as the Cold War. And I think that that's very instructive. And I think that what that has led to is basically the war on terror being the grammar, in some ways, of the international order itself, and Islamophobia being the grammar of the war on terror. And by that, I mean that a whole host of practices and descriptions and so-called labels are not so much labels, they are cues for certain practices to be instituted to deal with the so-called extremist Muslim, but by extension, anyone, and we know this very well, that this anti-terror legislation and so on, it's not just about targeting Muslims. They may say that, look, we have, but at the end of the day, it's about targeting dissent. It's about targeting the Palestine solidarity movements, other social justice movements, and so on. And that's why we have to understand Islamophobia as being about, when we say expressions of Muslimness, right now, the figure of the Muslim and Muslimness is of the dissident in some form or the other, that is in some ways a problem for these societies, a problem. And of course, often and very often, this is the interesting thing about Islamophobia. It's not only it's done on the backs and bodies of Muslims in general, but specifically of Muslim women. It's the only racism that predominantly, in fact, the ordinary street experience is done to Muslim women. So I think that we have to understand that the so-called neo-nationalist movements, when we think about Trump and so on, I don't think it's about populist leaders. It's about an attempt to redefine and to preserve a certain notion of what it means to be European, of what it means to be modern and Western. And that's what the figure of the Muslim interrupts. That's what the figure of the Palestinian interrupts. They are reminders. They are in some ways, they are hauntings of that racial colonial world order that has existed for 500 years. And they are, in some ways, a reminder of how much the West of Europe, and of course, we can deal with these problematic terms later, but because they're all socially constructed categories, but how increasingly they're being provincialized and decentered in our world order, that we are moving to a post-Western world. And in some ways, the response to Muslimness is this panic about basically realizing that world cannot continue. And the same thing, I'll conclude by this, but whether it's Israel, whether it's the Western plutocracies or any other states, there is right now, for that nation state, there's a crisis of legitimacy. And that's why you see, like I said, often these insane kind of panics about the Muslim. Take, for example, in Europe, you hear in Czech Republic, for example, barely, I think, 5,000 to 10,000 Muslims, but you hear politicians speaking of the Muslim apocalypse, that there's a demographic they're going to take over. In the United States, we had so many states pass anti-Sharia legislation. In states often where there's little to no Muslims and certainly no demand for Sharia law to be implemented. I mean, what is it about the Muslim? And again, I argue that it is a reminder. It is the idea, the way they're constructed and represented, the same way the Palestinian is a reminder of how that the order that they want to continue. And again, in the Western plutocracies, this is often an issue of white privilege, which is, of course, being challenged. But of course, when you hear the rhetoric of say, white genocide, etc., it's as if the loss of privilege is a loss itself, is just a loss of that you cannot be a European, you cannot be, that whiteness cannot exist without a certain sense of privilege. And so this is what, in some ways, the figure of the Palestinians, the figure of the Muslim, the way they haunt and remind the elites of the world that we continue to live in a colonial world order, in a racialized world order, in which the anti-Islamophobia struggle carries within it the emancipatory ethos to challenge that. It can fuse both the anti-racist that happened, and we know that that's when they were the most powerful, in the 1960s, when you had the fusion of the anti-colonial and the anti-racist movements. And so what both the Palestinians, the reminder that we live in such an ongoing world of coloniality, and the figure of the Muslim, what they in fact can do, that struggle, can fuse and can merge things that often the European Eurocentric view, divorce racism at home and from colonialism abroad. And I think that this has the potential to once again merge those struggles, the anti-racist, the anti-colonial, because Islamophobia carries certainly components of both, and so does the Palestinian struggle. So let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Junaid. That really was insightful too, for someone who did a degree in psychology at one stage. I do think it's got this projection, isn't it, of the things that you haven't come to terms with within your own society as well. And it's mixed up with othering, as the New York Times favorite verb was last year. But I thought that was very insightful. Just a reminder that you can, before we have a summary from Nida Arif, you can ask questions on Q&A and for the last 25 minutes or so, anytime from now on. Thank you. I'd like to introduce, last but not least, Nida Arif is a PhD candidate at the University of Delhi's Department of English. Her doctoral thesis is titled Arabs' Political Consciousness and Ghassan Kanafani's Literature Resistance, Adab al-Makawawa. I'm not sure where I'm saying that right. You can put me right there, Nida, later. She has translated parts of Kanafani's work, originally written in Arabic, into English, and her areas of interest include resistance, trauma and memory studies, and post-colonial writing and practice. And what she's going to do is to sum up what's been said and maybe have some way forward with Islamophobia. Thank you, Nida.
Okay. Am I audible? Okay. Am I audible, right?
You're okay, you're fine.
Yeah. So when we planned this webinar, we wanted to bring into light how a specific form of racism, Islamophobia, underlines so much of grammar of world politics of the time. And I'm glad that we were able to cover a lot of it. Its historical evolution, its historical roots, as Professor Pape laid it out, how some of its earliest forms were laid in during Crusades, and much of it, how it came to play an important role in how the legislators in Britain and the most powerful lobbyists in Britain weaponized it for their own interest, especially Christian evangelical groups, Christian Zionists, because we should remember that Christian Zionism predates modern political Zionism, and it's an important aspect to keep in mind while taking into account as to how and why a very Arab country, Palestine, became a settler colonial state, and got transformed within a space of a century to what is now predominantly a Jewish colonial state. So with that in mind, we also took account of an everyday example through Ahmad Hussein's presentation as to how the prison structures bear close coordinates with Zionists, and Emma took us through many of the parliamentarians in Britain and how they had how they were in close accord with Zionist lobbies, were often supporters, taken an oath to support it. And then we had Junaid's overview of things. And I'm glad that Junaid, even in this short space of time, was able to give us such a broad global picture of how so much of that violence is based on deep-seated hatred, distrust, and above all, that good old-fashioned greed of imperial wars. So so we were able to cover with all that in mind. As we were talking of it, and I'm an Indian, and Junaid was able to allude to it, things world over have been taking shape on the figure of Muslim, the Muslim as in to redefine ourselves. So I'll leave you all with an image and give you context of it. Just take a, I think so. Okay, so. But this came in mind just now, so I think I will not be able to, okay, let me try to share this screen with you. Okay. Okay, I think, all right. So what happened was that in 2019, we had anti-CA movement spread all across India. And then this movement was led by students in Delhi, that was in India, and in Delhi University and Jamia. So you had this figure of hijabbed women leading much of these protests and much of this. So yeah, to sum up, the dissent figure that Junaid talked of and the Muslim figure that we have been talking of it throughout the afternoon came together in this image of, I think I am not able to share the screen, but anyway, if any of you Google it, Jamia women fighting, it is the hijab-clad women fighting for the civil liberties. And that brought together the worst of the Islamophobia of Indian society and the best of the civil liberties movement. And we were able to see both the things together. So ironies as such as these, they mark the world that exists as of present, and we have a long and challenging road ahead to dismantle some of these bigotries and put together an organized resistance and to make the worst of the things better. And with this, I close the webinar and invite you all to ponder on things, ponder on everyday bigotries that some of us pass together, some of us do not pay attention to because it passes as common sense, and then get back to work. Bye.
Thank you, Nida. Yes, you're right. It is good to see people who are taking up that challenge. And that is the challenge that also Ahmed was giving us as well. Questions coming up, but one of the things that strikes me about phobia, you know, the definition, it means an irrational fear. And, you know, the Merchant of Venice 400 years ago told us that the Jews were the object of this irrational fear in Europe, sophisticated Europe. Where I come from, the Maori were called the noble savage. The Aboriginals in Australia were called the primitive savage. So this idea of sort of savagery and the other, I think, is very much ingrained, not just in the colonial experience, but also, you know, sort of tribal human nature. I've got one question here, and I'm just going to read it out. The ground reality around the world is hatred towards Muslims. How do we counter this? Even human rights groups and activists feel helpless in making changes. Right-wing governments are sanctioning the violence that we see as a result of hatred towards the Muslims. We need to find some practical organized campaigns to address the serious issue. So practical campaigns, any suggestions here about how do you counter hatred towards Muslims?
I will let Ahmed answer it. I think he has an organization in London. I just want to make sure that you notice, Steve, that there are also questions in the chat box, not just in the Q&A box.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, so but I will let Ahmed begin because he has such an organization, and then I would like to say something about it as well.
Thank you, Professor Lan. My general point would be, if you feel as an individual that you're powerless, then take the time to look into organizations that are doing something. And, you know, there are so many different organizations just in the UK that I know that have different approaches, different attitudes. You know, there's a flavor for everyone. So, you know, if you're comfortable doing direct actions, if you're comfortable doing campaigns, if you're comfortable doing long-term kind of thinking, long-term kind of campaigning, there's an organization for everyone. And obviously, I would specifically point out MPAC UK. We've been running for 2 decades now, and we started off as a organization that was interested in the plight of the Palestinians. So tackling Zionism is a cause that is central to us as an organization. But the general point, as an individual, it is very understandable to feel powerless and weak. And that is how the elite want you to feel. A common thread going through what all three of the speakers, all of us have been talking about is a sense of elite trying to divide and conquer us. You know, Muslims are being portrayed as the other, the out group, and that out group is then targeted because that then unites the citizenry in shunning that out group, and uniting the citizenry in hating an out group distracts them from focusing their efforts on reform, demanding and getting reform from the elites. If you're feeling like an individual who is powerless, join with those who are working on campaigns and other long-term projects, inshallah.
Yes, if I may add something, Steve.
Please.
Yes, definitely, maybe in the same vein of Ahmed's wise words. I think this is true about not just people who are targeted through Islamophobic campaigns when they speak on Palestine. People who speak on behalf of Palestine are targeted. And I think that one of the things we learned throughout the last decade and even a little bit before it, that we should never face these allegations and these campaigns by ourselves. An individual person cannot withstand such a campaign. And there is in place networking of solidarity and support that sometimes succeeds, sometimes is less successful, but it doesn't matter. The networking is growing. And what is so impressive about the network, it is not just about one group that is targeted by racism. We are now talking about a variety of groups around the globe or in your own country that is targeted because of their religion, because of their ethnicity, because of their color, and they are working together against any form of racism and colonialism that oppresses them. A very good example is the African American community. Until the 1980s, the vast majority of African Americans who you would see standing alongside people who supported the Palestinians in the US were African Americans that converted to Islam and were much more connected to the Muslim identity. Nowadays, it's all over the place because the kind of oppression the Palestinians are experiencing is in the open. You cannot hide it anymore. And the connection between the oppression of African Americans in Ferguson and the oppression of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is now being recognized, that it's working together. And the same racism that is targeted today towards Muslims in Britain is targeting people because of their Arabism and not just because of their Islam and so on. So I think this is a network that has to be strengthened and be even more effective. In the last month, we had 3 cases in Britain of 3 different people targeted in the British academia, losing the job because of expressing support for Palestine. One of them, David Miller, even mentioned our topic. He mentioned that Islamophobia is weaponized by Israel in order to suppress discussion on Palestine. And this was given as one of the reasons for his dismissal of the university. But once we have grouped these 3 cases together, and we're fighting for all these 3 cases together, we are much more powerful in our ability, maybe even to change the consequences of the attack on them personally, but definitely to raise public awareness that there is a cynical and callous campaign of suppression when it comes to talking on behalf of Palestine.
Anyone further on that one? Here's an interesting one from Indonesia. And I'm from Indonesia. My Muslim colleagues here have talked a lot about Islamism. I would like to hear from the speakers their thoughts about the rise of conservatism, even radicalism in Islam, which is often described as the mark of Islamism. So not sure what conservatism, but maybe not changing and maybe more radical as well. Any comments there?
I don't mind jumping in if no one else.
Yeah, go.
So my thoughts, in general, are a person only changes track in terms of ideology and behavior as a reaction to something that they believe they need to see a change in. So what would a community of Muslims be reacting to? I mean, if a community of Muslims see that the way their community or what they perceive as the Muslim community is not enacting a positive impact on the world, then that could be the factor needed to make them change path in terms of their interpretation of Islam and so on. The reason I say that as a starting point is because if we honestly, and I say this as a Muslim, if we honestly appraise the behavior of Muslim leaders on the international stage, we see how their attitude towards Palestine, their attitude towards fellow Muslims, Yemen, Syria, Libya, etc. We see a leadership that is inevitably going to create a reaction amongst the general Muslim populace. The general Muslim populace on the grassroots levels does feel an empathy with what we call the Ummah, the Muslim global community. And when they see Muslim leadership not reflecting that genuine concern for the global Ummah, the reaction is only human, that look, the leaders are behaving in such a way, therefore that way of behaving can't be right. And then that reaction can take many forms depending on which country that individual is, what particular subset community within that country that person originally saw themselves as part of. I'm just giving a very general answer because this question came from Indonesia. I'm not particularly aware what the situation is like there in India, but that is my thought, my general thought. A person changes track in their interpretation and behavior to Islam as a reaction to their perception of what's going on in the world.
Steve, if I may add?
Please.
Yeah, so just two or three things on this. One is, and I picked up a lot on this when I was visiting Southeast Asia, but actually, whether this is Southeast Asia, whether this was Pakistan, whether it's all parts of the Muslim world, the post 9/11 discourse on Islam and Muslims throughout the world developed these highly problematic categories to define what type of Muslim, whether they were conservative, extremist, traditional, fundamentalist, etc. Of course, this has a lineage before 9/11, but it, of course, really, really escalated. And it became very, very problematic how these narratives and this language and vocabulary emanating from Washington and London, etc., exported throughout the Muslim world and adopted, unfortunately, by many societies who are, of course, not immune to the cultural imperialism of the West. So I think one of the things that Muslims, whether in Southeast Asia or elsewhere, need to do is continue a project of decolonization. And that means decolonizing not just of the material reality, which is important, but of course of the mind from these narratives and discourses that come, and understand that these categories often are incredibly Eurocentric and problematic, and that we often need to develop our own languages. So that's the first thing. But I don't want to be dismissive of the idea that, and this is when I get back to the idea of Islamophobia. So I think Islamophobia is not a response, as many people will say, to say 9/11, or I mean, we have to remember, I think Ahmed will know this. I mean, for example, the Runnymede Commission report in England, it came out in 1997, the Commission report on Islamophobia. So clearly something existed before that. And the thing that I would emphasize, that in fact, Islamophobia, one of the things that it is centrally a response to is the assertion of a Muslim political identity, Muslim subjectivity, which was not there before. One of the things we need to remember, and I think Ahmed just mentioned it as well, is that we lived in, past the 20th century in a context, putting aside the Western societies, even within the Muslim majority world, in which you had the domination of a post-colonial elite which subscribed to what we often call Kemalist ideology, which was deeply Islamophobic, which wanted to get Islam outside. I mean, whether it's outside the public sphere and just Islam outside of everything. And so what you saw, you can find different events that mark that, whether it's the 79 Iranian Revolution and further developments, but you saw the assertion of a Muslim identity, public political subjectivity throughout the 80s, both throughout the Muslim world and particularly within the Western societies as well, and particularly converging around, Ahmed will know this very well, around the satanic verses in the late 1980s, in which you had, whereas before, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc., you had, say, Pakistanis, you had Bangladeshis, etc. All of a sudden, you have Muslims. It's no longer Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, etc. You have this category of Muslim, which was not there before. And so I think that we have to understand that, these terms, Islamism and so on, and, I'm not sure how helpful they are at times. Often, I think this is, we conflate these terms with the assertion of a Muslim subjectivity. Now, at the same time, I will also add that the phenomena that we see that often we'll find, some of us will find distasteful or so on and so forth, or the highly kind of militarized responses. We also have to understand, and I think Professor Pape, referred to this in the context of Israel-Palestine, but throughout the Muslim world, I mean, look, you had a global jihad in the 1970s and early 80s, supported by the entire Western political establishment, funds, arms, etc., so on and so forth. Went there. So this had an impact. This clearly had an impact that, of course, we Muslims have been living with. I mean, I don't know. We have to kind of take a decolonial perspective. The principal people who have been living with this, for better or worse, have been Muslims themselves. So there's a material historical analysis that often is missed out, of the analysis, and we just think about it as well. Muslims, their theology, Islam, the Quran, etc., as if Muslims are robots. And this is the other thing that often happens with regard to Muslims, Palestinians, and so on, is that there's this pole, either they're what we call the fatalists, they have no agency, they just do what, say, the Quran tells them, they don't do anything because only agency is only, of the West, and they only have Paul, or that goes from that to the fanatic. So they're either underactive or they're overactive. And so I think that we have to understand that these categories are themselves often problematic, and we also have to do sound historical, sociological, political analysis to often understand these phenomena and go away from the way that wants to pin all of this down to Islamic theology.
Yes, and it's interesting how it ties in with the idea of orthodoxy. I remember after the bombing in 7/7 in 2005, the council came out and condemned it, the Muslim Council. That was very powerful, I think, to say, well, look, here is something that we publicly prepared to disassociate ourselves from. Look, there's some interesting questions here, but a number of them are asking practical things to do. I think, Ahmed, you had some practical things at the end of your presentation there, and someone from New Zealand is saying price of coffee to support the Palestinian Solidarity Network here. But aside from joining organizations, any other practical suggestions?
So joining an organization, the reason I emphasize that is because organizations amplify our efforts. So everything that I say that I could list, one person doing it is not going to create the change. A unified organization doing it would, but things like boycotting businesses, when it comes to boycotting, you have to make a loud fuss who you're boycotting and why. Because otherwise you're just changing your shopping habits. It's not a boycott until it's publicized and the business is being humiliated. Schools and colleges, again, one concerned parent versus a concerted effort to tackle the governors of a school or a college. You can see easily the world of difference between the two efforts. Universities, again, one university student versus a Palestine society or an Islamic society taking its vice chancellors, or I'm not familiar with what different terms around the world would be, but those in authority in the university, an entire student society body versus an individual student, that's a world of difference as well. And specifically within the Muslim communities, like in the UK, where it's a non-Muslim country, and the infrastructure of Muslim institutions is not directly linked to government. So madrasas and mosques have an added responsibility in countries like the UK to represent Muslim concerns. And unfortunately, the majority of mosques in countries like the UK are very pacified, are very much like, we don't want to cause trouble. There's trouble with Islamophobes and so on happening over there. We don't really want to bring it into our own town. But the truth of the matter is, Muslim institutions like mosques and madrasas, they have a responsibility to represent Muslim concerns and so on. Those are some, but I really cannot emphasize enough, the first step should be joining an organization. Zionism has been around for decades. It's not going to be resolved by one person, even the most well-meaning individual in the world, doing everything that they can. join an organization?
Yes, and the Labour Party last week, its ability to be able to galvanize support around even the articulation of what they want to happen. We've got one coming up as well, which our Indigenous Minister of Foreign Affairs is looking to give her permission to be able to, go bolder. So I think those political, even youth ones are very important as well. Anyone else got anything to add there?
Yes, I do. I want to say that one of the major obstacles we have usually when we are exposed to Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian campaigns, which have behind them powerful institutions and coalitions, is that the mainstream media, and sometimes also the mainstream academia, is willingly going along with these campaigns. And they're dangerous in their support because they tend to give the impression that these prejudices and defamations are based on proper scholarly research or proper journalistic research. And it's not very easy to counter it because you cannot counter it with a soundbite, because reality of being a Muslim or what Islam is, or what happens in Palestine, all these three issues are complex issues. It cannot be explained in one sentence and two sentences. You need a span of attention, which is much longer than a few minutes, by someone who is willing at least to hear that there are distortions in myth and lies and fabrications when it comes either to Islam, Muslims, or Palestine. So we have a lot of work to do in the academia, first of all, to confront these fabrications. And those of us who do public advocacy have a problem because sometimes you are cornered to explain yourself in one or two sentences, and you can't. You can only, you cannot meet a slogan with a slogan. To undo a slogan, you need time to explain. But I think we should insist on that thing. I remember in 2001, I happened to be in New York a little bit after 9/11, and I was lucky enough to stay a little bit with Edward Said. And he got calls from the American main media stations asking him to come to the studio and explain what Islam is. And he said, how long do I have? And they said, you'll have between 2 and 3 minutes. And he refused. He refused. He said, I'm not going, this is not serious. And unfortunately, a lot of American academics at the time, those we call the Orientalists, came to the studio and gave these stupid 2 or 3 sentences that didn't help anyone, even when they well meant, by the way, when they had a good intention to try and say, this is not Islam, what we have seen, or no, it doesn't matter. We should insist. And if they don't give us a space, demand the space. So that's one thing. I think it's very, 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 very important. And that's one of the reasons I founded the Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. I understood you need a whole center, you need a whole program of studies if you want to challenge 50 or 70 years of misinformation and propaganda that was given in the form of academic research. You cannot undo it by just talking about it. You have to offer an alternative. Similarly, about journalism, we should not allow them to corner us into these soundbites and slogans that serves them at the end of the day. If they don't have time, we don't do this. But if they want to hear, and they need to hear other voices, more eventually, we should demand the time to explain exactly what's going on.
Yes,
Steve,
yes,
Steve, can I just say? Yeah, so just bouncing on off of what Professor Pape said, he's absolutely right. One of the things that should, completely be, in some ways considered or discredited in some ways. It was well-intentioned, of course, after 9/11 and often after any of such incidents take place, the Muslims felt compelled to, of course, condemn what's happened and then often speak about Islam as a religion of peace. And this would be an ongoing, constant mantra, Islam is peace. One of the things that we should realize is that Islamophobia within the United States, about 7, 8, 9, culminating in say when Trump, it actually escalated. So after 9/11, there was Islamophobia, but about a decade later, there was in fact more Islamophobia in the US. So one of the things is clearly that approach did not work. Whether it's Islam is peace and is interfaith, it has its value. But one of the things that we should take from that is that ultimately the struggle against Islamophobia, which is a form of racism, is a political struggle. It's a political struggle in which you make alliances with others who are also involved in anti-racist and social justice work.
Thank you. Hassanal, how long have we got? Are you there, Hassanal?
Yep, Steve, we got about, I think we can give 10 more minutes, then we can wrap it up.
There's a number of comments and questions here about the relationship between religion and secular values, and people talking about maybe Islamophobia is on the decline, but also the need for religions to move away from a fundamentalist approach to maybe one where there are secular values that people can agree with, if I can sum up those. Any comments on the relationship there between Islamophobia and other religions or secular values?
If I may jump in, just as one sentence. I just finished reading a great book called The Ecumenical Frame by my good friend, Professor Sari Magdisi from the University of Texas, which describes the relationship between various religious groups in the Mashriq. Mashriq is the eastern part of the Middle East that includes the Palestine, and between the cosmopolitical, if you want, you can call it a bit secular world that developed in the beginning of the 20th century in some of the coastal towns such as Alexandria, Jaffa, Beirut, and so on. And what comes out very, very strongly is the dialogical nature of the society, that there was no attempt to win over by force a certain perception of morality and life and so on. But on the other hand, there was enough tolerance, if you want, to allow a different way of life that was somewhat different from your own. And this was done within an empire that was recognized as a Muslim empire, that was recognized as the one that inherited the Islamic civilization and its values, which transcended beyond the Middle East and to places like Southeast Asia and Africa, and that this is not a romantic view that beautifies every moment of encounter. It does not gloss over the moments of friction or the moment even of violent clash, but it shows quite clearly actually that the points of real violent clash between that kind of disrupt this dialogical reality that I'm talking about, where when external powers intervene to pit one force against the other. So this book, for example, challenges the whole idea of sectarianism. And it says sectarianism is a bit like a race. I mean, there are no races in the world. There's racism that produces race. And sectarianism produces sect, right? What you have is people living sometimes with very commonalities that are very similar, whatever their face and attitude to face is, and some things that distinguish them from one another. The idea that there are sects was brought by Western imperialism because of the divide and rule benefits of dividing communities into different sects and making sure that you can sometimes pit one against the other. Why am I saying all of this? That lofty secularism of the 1970s that believed that it had the power, in the words of Jamal Abdel Nasser, to push religion into the museum, totally failed. And this is one of the biggest mistakes of the left. And rebuilding this dialogue between people who may not share everything in terms of how they relate to religion, faith, or even morality, but sharing the joint struggle against oppression, occupation, and colonization, and then rebuilding a post-colonial reality where dialogue is a way of life and not necessarily something that leads to a solution. There's a lot of work to be done there. It's not going to be easy, but we are wasting every given moment if we're still oppressed and we're still occupied and we're still colonized for investing in this kind of a dialogue, which will be necessary for the British society, for the American society, not just for Palestine and not just for India, but also for Australia and New Zealand. And therefore, this is the kind of later stage where you turn a world where there's still something that Paul Gilmore used to call infrahumanity, when you still have humans who are not treated equally as humans because of their race, because of their color, because of their religion, and because of racism. Before, you have to go through this stage, first of all, of liberation and freedom. And then, of course, you need all your human energies and capacity and wisdom to build a dialogical society that would enable people to have a way of life that lives and let live. But we are not there yet. We are definitely not there yet. And I think this is something very important to remember.
dialogical society, Ilan? How do you mean?
A dialogical society does not take the West. There is a Western notion of what a dialogue is. Dialogue is something that brings to a result. Someone convinces someone else that they were wrong, and their way of looking at things defeated the other way of looking at things. In the Arab world, even before Islam, but definitely after Islam, the way of, and also in some societies in Southeast Asia, in Latin, in South America, a dialogue is not leading to a solution, but is accepted as a way of life. You continue to discuss, even if the discussion does not result in a total agreement. If you want it in simplistic terms, it's the agreement not to agree, but I think that simplifies it. It's a reductionist way of looking at it. It's more than agreeing not to agree. It's living with a disagreement in a way that enables living. And I'm as a historian also of the late Ottoman period, and especially on Palestine, of course, at that period, I was surprised how well it worked. I'll give you just one short example from my hometown, Haifa. When you went to Haifa before 48 to certain streets, and as a British colonialist official or as a Zionist spy, and you wanted to know who is a Muslim and who is a Christian, you know, people had some difficulties to remember exactly that they didn't feel that this was a particular distinction that meant anything under mandatory rule and under the danger of Zionist colonization. After the creation of the State of Israel, Israel insists that people would commodify their religious identity so that it would help Israel to prove that there isn't such a thing as Palestinians. There are Muslims, there are Christians, there are Druze, and they're not nationalized, and Israel can play with these identities. So I think that's what I meant by dialogical.
Steve, if I can very quickly, yeah. I know we're short on time. So I mean, this the issue of secularism. I mean, we have to understand that this is a constant trope of a weapon, a bludgeon used against. I mean, principally, it's been used now against Muslim societies that and against Muslims generally. Part of what I was speaking about earlier about how that's the problem with them. They just cannot adjust to kind of modernity, which is centrally reliant on the way secularism has unfolded within the West. And again, that is supposed to be the template for Muslim societies, for all societies. And herein that lies, that's the problem in itself. The Muslims are expected to undertake a reformation, in which case they will need to invent a pope first to carry out that reformation against. And we hear every couple of years we have a new Muslim Martin Luther. Again, this is all very particular to the way, and it's very in fact, a post-Enlightenment Western reading of the way secularism and Christianity emerged even within the West. So I think that herein lies the principal problem. And the other thing, just very concretely, is the experience that Muslims have had with secular regimes. I mean, this is, in some ways, we have to remember when speaking about the rise of Islamism and so on, yes, partially they were powerful backers of it. At the same time, we also have to remember they're operating in context in which, these secular regimes, deeply authoritarian, deeply repressive, have far more bodies in terms of people killed, etc., to their account than any Islamist regime. So I think that we have to understand it in the context within the Muslim majority world. In the West, I mean, the principal sort of defender of so-called secularism is France, and their laïcité, which has little to do with secularism and more to do with unchecked racism, I would argue. And so these are the experiences that Muslims have with supposedly secularism. And so I think that we have to understand that these terms become deeply problematic, and that what I was arguing earlier, how we need to embark on this decolonial journey in some ways also then entails interrogating these terms that come from a colonial modernity, which often don't have any relation to these societies.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, because I remember in the 70s, secular really was a negative term, but by the 90s in my country anyway, it became a common ground on which all religions met, and it became a kind of neutral or almost positive meaning. That was a change. Look, there's a number of people here who are interested in the racism part underlying Islamophobia. What is the essence of racism? Privilege, as someone suggests here? Can we end up with something which is looking at the irrational part of Islamophobia? Is it just fear of the other, clash of civilizations?
I could add a minor point, but I believe Professor Junaid and Professor Ilan would be able to give a more substantial response. But from my point of view, it would be racism is part and package of the convenience that the elite feel, that the elite have in creating an outgroup for their citizenry to focus their frustrations on. Being in the UK, for me, the most obvious case of this has been the whole Brexit situation, where for generations, for decades, the EU was scapegoated as the reason for so many things that led to a difficult life for many people in Britain. Now that we have Brexited, suddenly it's become very, very obvious that the systemic reasons for the low quality of life of so many in Britain was not the EU after all. Likewise, this outgrouping of a community for the sake of convenience is one of the root reasons for call it racism, call it xenophobia, etc., etc. That's one of the root causes that such a mentality is not only allowed to fester, but systemically is encouraged to fester as well. That's the starting point. And then once that mentality becomes not just widespread, but legitimized through political parties and their manifestos, through media pundits, through institutions of the state, such as schools and medical professions and so on, then that becomes it just becomes embedded in society. So how do we reverse that? For me, the way I see it, the reason I'm in MPAC UK, I see it as tackling the attitudes and the primary motivations of the elite. If we can cut the roots of the reasons why racism, outgrouping, etc., is allowed and encouraged to happen, then we can start watching that rotten plant wither.
No, I think that's a good place to end there, because all that, to me, has been a very full webinar of insights, but also people trying to look at the sociological aspects as well as those psychological ones. Look, I'm going to finish it there. Hassanal, thank you very much for a reminder of time. Thank you for the panelists, Ilan Pape, Junaid Ahmed Hussein, and of course, Nida Arif. Thank you very much for the contributions of people who contributed questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to 4 or 5 there at the end. Someone said, would you agree or disagree that this dialogue was worthwhile or a waste of time? I think it was definitely the first, but thank you for your question. So, Hassan, I'll leave it up to you now.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to all the speakers and panelists. This webinar will have been streamed on the Palestine Updates 11 Facebook group. And I would like to invite actually for all the speakers and panelists to maybe just gather and stay on for just a quick group photo, if that's okay. Sure.
Yeah, and one person asked if some of the books mentioned could be maybe posted, maybe some of your books there, Prof. and Junaid, Prof. Junaid and Prof. Ilan. Yeah, thank you.
Yep, I mentioned it, I responded to that question as well, but I'll put my email on the chat for everyone to also email me, and I can probably compile the bibliography together with Professor Ilan and the others, and I can send it to you if you would like. So everyone on the attendee side, you can just email me and I'll get back to you on that one. So, okay, so with everyone ready, I'll just take one group photo.